Chapter 7, Identifying a Research Problem and Formulating a Research Question. Indica Karan Community Paroma. Abstract. Identifying a research problem and formulating a research question are often considered the toughest part of a research. The reason for this is it is often considered that the research question is the heart or the engine of our research. The process of developing a research question is fraught with constant traps and pitfalls. Avoiding these need a structured, methodical, and disciplined approach. The first step of such an approach is identifying a research problem which is of practical and theoretical value. Deriving a research question from the research problem is an iterative process of subjecting the research question to repeated scrutiny using three basic question forms: what, why, and how. These three question forms facilitate the critical review, refinement, and conversion of an initial broad and non-specific research question into a focused, specific, unambiguous, and researchable research question. This chapter explores the finer aspects of the art and science of identifying a research problem and converting it to a research question. Key words: hypothesis, health professions, education, research, medical education. Assess need. Health professions teachers are trained well in research in their own disciplines. They know how to identify a research problem, wade through the literature around that problem, carve out a research question from it, and conduct a research that stretches the knowledge base in their discipline. Health professions teachers also encounter many educational situations that they do not know how best to tackle. Many do not consider the problems that these situations pose as fertile grounds for research. The reason for this is educational research considerably differs from most health professions research. The lens through which an educational problem should be viewed to make it the starting point of a successful research study requires training in educational research. Such training offers a way of thinking to the health professions teachers so that an educational issue at hand could be transformed into a researchable question. This chapter takes the reader through the steps of the thinking process of developing such a research question. Brief. Health professions education research demands a unique skill set, often distinct from the traditional discipline-based research that the health professionals have been trained in. Like in any other field, the research question is the make or break element of a research that determines its quality. Developing a good health professions education research question requires a sound knowledge in core theories of health professions education, an in-depth understanding of a way of thinking unique to educational research, and hands-on experience in developing research questions. Identifying a research problem that has both practical and theoretical relevance is the key to designing a research question. Constructing a good research question can be achieved by figuring out the answers to the three questions of what, why, and how in an iterative process. CO and 3XTUARIZE. A physiology lecturer has been teaching online almost exclusively due to the ongoing COVID-19 pandemic. He has been often wondering how effective what he does when compared with the traditional face-to-face teaching. However, he acknowledges that online learning also offers some fabulous facilities for the students to learn, unlearn, and relearn at their own pace, while interacting with a wide range of learning resources. He wonders whether offering the student both online and on-site options so that the student can blend the two modes based on their own learning preferences would be the best option. This pushes him to look for an answer from the literature. He types in the words the search terms: blended learning, effectiveness, and health professions education. The results show that almost all articles have found blended learning either more effective than or at least as effective as another type of learning. He languishes that although the evidence seems to be convincing, it is certainly not beyond reasonable doubt. There may be instances that blended learning is only as effective as other modes of learning. He wonders why blended learning is only as effective as other learning modes. It may be that in different study settings, the circumstances, learning facilities, ratio of blending, and student preferences and preparedness are different. Since the results seem to be contextual rather than universal, at least to an extent, he decides that the only way to find out whether blended learning is more effective than other modes of learning is to conduct his own research. So he plans a research to find out the effectiveness of learning with different teaching and learning modes, i.e., blended, online, and on-site learning. His preliminary research question is, what is the effectiveness of blended learning when compared with online or on-site learning? However, he realizes that this research question is rudimentary and unrefined yet. To refine it further, he asks himself a few more questions. What exactly are the type of learning that I am investigating? Who are my study participants? Is it feasible to divide the participants into three groups to administer blended, online, and on-site learning? Answers to these questions do not come to the lecturer effortlessly. He expands on the previous literature search with a view to learning from how other researchers have tackled similar research questions. What he learns from the literature along with his own thinking provides him with his updated research question. What is the effectiveness of blended learning when compared with online or on-site learning related to cardiovascular physiology among the first-year medical students? This updated research question too is far from complete. The lecturer is still unclear about who exactly are the three student groups. What am I measuring to find the effectiveness? Is it fair and ethical to create these three groups? How can I measure learning in each of the three methods? When answering these questions, the lecturer conducts an even more thorough literature search and tries to learn how other researchers have conducted similar research. Both through what he has learned from the literature and what he has figured out for himself through a structured, methodical thinking process, he manages to devise the following complete research question. When blended, online, and on-site learning modes are compared, what is more effective in assimilating knowledge on cardiovascular physiology by the first-year medical students at Medical School X in 2021? Describe what is a research question. A research question has a few critical features. First and foremost, it should be a question. However, it should not be just a question. It should be a question that is researchable. In the above scenario, one could argue that the research questions produced both initially and after the first revision are non-researchable questions. The initially produced question states, what is the effectiveness of blended learning when compared with online or on-site learning? This question is non-researchable because it does not specify what is meant by effectiveness. Effectiveness can be simply based on the participant perceptions, or it can be more objectively measured using a purpose-made assessment. The research question also does not state effectiveness on what. Is it effectiveness in relation to particular content area, e.g., cardiovascular physiology, anatomy of the locomotor system? Hence, no one knows how effectiveness should be measured in this research study. Even after the first revision, the research question still does not convey what effectiveness means, although it is more specific about the content area, i.e., cardiovascular physiology. Similarly, the first two attempts do not exactly specify who the research participants are. With such research questions, almost anything is possible. By contrast, the final research question is researchable as it is specific to a level that will produce a comparable study no matter who conducts it. The next crucial feature of our research question is that it should lead to a research. This then poses the question, what is a research? There are a few cardinal features of a research. An investigation, to be called a research, should be based on data, should produce results generalizable beyond the study, and most importantly, must lead to new knowledge or at least extend the existing knowledge. It is the latter feature that a research question is mostly responsible for. In the above scenario, For example, there seems to be considerable evidence that blended learning is more effective than online or on-site learning. In that case, what the researcher should ask themselves is that how can he justify conducting such a research? How the researcher has justified this study is by finding a gap in the existing evidence. That is a relative lack of evidence for the effectiveness of blended learning in a setting similar to the present study. This justification is further vindicated by the fact that our previous research has not unequivocally indicated that blended learning is more effective than the other modes of teaching and learning. The other important features of a good research question are that it should be clearly worded without any ambiguity, it should be succinct, and it should be readily understandable or easily and uniformly interpreted. Why a research question? The research question forms the heart of a research. This means all other steps in a research are dependent on how good the research question is. To illustrate this, the above scenario could be extended to show how the research question is instrumental in determining the next steps of our research. Once the research question is ready, the most important next step is to identify a broad research approach. There are three broad research approaches in health professions: education research, quantitative, qualitative, and mixed methods. In the scenario above, given that the researcher considers investigating the effectiveness in terms of assimilation of knowledge, it is likely that the researcher considers assessment of knowledge to find the answer to the research question. Since knowledge is traditionally assessed by quantifying knowledge using scores or grades, this research question seems to point towards a quantitative approach. That said, it is not impossible to find out what the students have learned using interviews and then qualitatively compare the richness of the knowledge gained by the participants in the three different groups. If the researcher wants to adopt such an approach, however, it would be better if the research question is slightly modified. When blended online and on-site learning modes are compared, what are the differences in the richness of knowledge on cardiovascular physiology assimilated by the first-year medical students at Medical School X in 2021? Thus, removing the term more effective has given the research question a more qualitative outlook. Similarly, the original research question can be used for mixed methods approach if effectiveness can be operationally defined to include both assessment and student perception. The foregoing illustrates how the research question determines the broad methodological approach that the researcher should adopt. Not only the methodological approach, but every step in the research process is also controlled and determined by the research question. For instance, in the above scenario, the next step would be to identify the specific research methods. Given the nature of the final research question in the scenario, if a quantitative approach is selected, then the researcher can adopt an experimental study design. Within an experimental study design, if a classical pre-post test comparison is used with the online group as the control, then the researcher should evaluate a few critical issues. For example, does the researcher have sufficient numbers in the study sample to form three groups? Is random assigning of students ethical? Given that the group that they are assigned to may not be their preferred learning mode, and how the researcher plans to control cross-contamination, given the tendency of students to use multiple learning modes at home. If the answers to any of these questions are less than satisfactory, the researcher must either change the study design from an experimental to a quasi-experimental study or change the research to a qualitative study approach. In the case of the latter, the researcher may have to go back to the research question and modify it as discussed earlier within this section. Study design apart, the data collection methods and tools, and the data analysis methods that the researcher uses should generate results capable of answering the research question. Finally, the conclusion of the study should accurately answer the research question. All this shows how important the research question is in determining the course of our research. Steps of developing a research question, as can be seen by the above discussion. Developing a high-quality research question is the key to the success of our research. Given its importance, a carefully planned, structured approach is needed when developing a research question. There are two main steps in the journey towards a successful research question. First, an appropriate research problem should be identified. Second, a systematic, methodical, and stepwise process should be followed to develop the research question from the thus identified research problem. These two steps are further explained below. A good research problem must ideally have two components: practical relevance and theoretical relevance. Practical relevance means the results and conclusion of the research should improve on ground practice. In the above scenario, for example, the researcher has a practical problem to solve, and that is to find out what is the most effective mode of teaching and learning for cardiovascular physiology. Finding an evidence-based answer to this problem will improve the educational practice of not only the researcher, but many others in similar settings. The latter is the generalizability of the conclusion that is expected from a research. Usually, it is the practical relevance that initiates a research project by a ground-level practitioner such as a teacher. However, if the research question is sound, it should also provide some theoretical relevance. This means the solution to the research question should also provide some useful information, at least to extend the current theoretical understanding in the field of study. In the above scenario, theoretical relevance is not extensive as it is a practical problem that triggers the research. However, since educational theory, or at least how the theory can be applied, is contextual and content specific. In context similar to the researcher's setting, there seems to be a lack of evidence as to which teaching and learning mode is most effective. This is further supported by the current evidence that blended learning may either be more effective than or as effective as other modes of teaching and learning. So, even from the theoretical standpoint, the research that this researcher plans to conduct is justifiable as it will add to the knowledge base to further clarify this ambiguity in evidence and contribute to either tipping the balance toward or away from blended learning. This would be theoretical relevance of this study. Once the practical and theoretical relevance have been established, the formal development of the research question should begin adopting the systematic and structured process alluded to above. The key to this process is to consider the development of a research question as an iterative, as opposed to a one-off process of testing the original research idea with a series of critical questions. These critical questions form the basic building blocks of constructing a research question. They can be summarized as what, why, and how. What is to specify what is being researched? Why indicates the reasons or justifications for the research, and how is to detail the methods of research. The researcher must ask these questions iteratively in several rounds. A question developed in the first few rounds would be broad and non-specific. In each round, the research question would be narrowed down to a more specific and refined question. When answering the three questions in each round, the relevant literature should be consulted and the possible research methods should be evaluated. This process must go on for at least 3 rounds before finalizing the research question. In the above scenario, what refers to the effectiveness of the 3 modes of teaching and learning. Non-specific and broad question as it may be, the researcher could not have come up with this question had he not referred to the existing literature to verify whether there is already convincing evidence to answer this question. The researcher decides to go ahead with the research once it is confirmed that there is a gap in the current evidence base. In the next round, the researcher further narrows down the initial part formulated question to a more specific question by adding the effectiveness of the 3 modes of teaching and learning related to cardiovascular physiology among first-year medical students. This may have happened after further considering the practical relevance. and after consulting the literature to identify a relative paucity of literature on teaching and learning of cardiovascular physiology. In the third round, the researcher further cones down the research question by further specifying and qualifying what is meant by effectiveness. The effectiveness of assimilating knowledge on cardiovascular physiology when the three modes of teaching and learning are compared among the first-year medical students at medical school acts in 2021. It is clear from this example that it is not only the place, but the timing of research should also be indicated within the research question. The above illustration is only concerned with the question what. The other two questions should also be addressed similarly when developing a complete research question. The possible questions that should go through a researcher's mind when formulating the research question for all three questions is summarized in Table 1. Table 1, Summary of the steps of developing a research question using a practical example. Round iteration. Round 1, question form. What exact question? What is the broad area of my study? Answer, effectiveness teaching and learning modes, i.e., blended, online, and on-site. Research question. What is the effectiveness of blended learning when compared with online or on-site learning? Why? Why should I study this area of research? Because there is ambiguity in the current evidence, and it is not known whether the existing evidence is applicable to the current study setting. How should I study this concern? By comparing the three modes of learning. Round 2. What exactly is the type of learning that I am investigating? Who are my participants? Cardiovascular physiology first-year medical students. What is the effectiveness of blended learning when compared with online or on-site learning related to cardiovascular physiology among the first-year medical students? Why am I investigating knowledge from this particular content area? Because there is no evidence on the effectiveness of the three modes of learning related to this content area. How can I divide the participants into three groups to administer blended online and on-site learning? Since an estimated 150 students will consent for this research, each group will have enough numbers to derive conclusion with sufficient power. Round 3. What exactly am I measuring to find the effectiveness? Who are the three student groups? Knowledge assimilation and retention of cardiovascular physiology. First-year students voluntarily assigned to the three group from medical school during 2021. When blended, online and on-site learning modes are compared, what is more effective in assimilating knowledge on cardiovascular physiology by the first-year medical students at medical school in 2021. Why can I still justify conducting this research given that this is on assimilation of cardiovascular physiology? There is no literature in this area of study. Given the context specificity of most literature, and given that there is ambiguity in the existing literature, it is still justifiable. How can I measure learning in terms of knowledge assimilation in each of the three methods? Is it ethical to divide participants into three groups? Measuring knowledge will be through multiple choice questions administered before and after learning. Random sampling may be unethical. So I need to consider the student preferences when allocating the students into the three groups and force them to follow a particular type of learning only. During every round, if the researcher identifies the answer to a particular question unsatisfactory, then the researcher will have to address it then and there, and then go through the previous round as to find out whether the research question as a whole makes sense. Sometimes the researcher may have to start the process again from a previous round. Summarize. Writing a fit-for-purpose research question is both challenging and enjoyable. The process starts by identifying a practically and theoretically relevant research problem. Converting the research problem into a research question is never finalized until it is put through a structured and rigorous thought process. This thought process comprises three question forms: what, why, and how, known as the basic building blocks of our research question. These three question forms should be used iteratively to test and refine the evolving research question. During each iteration or round, the research question should become more specific, focused, and researchable. If the evolving research question is found wanting during a given round, amendments should be made and the process should be restarted from the initial rounds. The finalized research question should then be used to guide every step of the research process. Evaluate. This section is meant to encourage the readers to reflect and self-evaluate their learning at the end of the chapter. The following assignments may help in this process. Identify a research problem that you have been thinking of. Read the literature to find out if your problems have already been answered in the literature. Try to convert your problem into a research question. When doing so, try to answer the three fundamental questions: what, why, and how. Think about the research approaches, study designs, data, and participants you will need to answer the research question. Go through this process iteratively until you are satisfied with the final research question. If you are not satisfied, make the necessary changes and go back to previous iterations to check that the line of thinking has no gaps. Finalize the research question and use it effectively to determine the next steps in the course of the research.